Francisco de Chagas Rodriguez de Brito was not easy to research, mostly due to horrid translations into English from Portuguese. Google really has to work on that. The national language of Brazil, of course, where Chagas is currently in prison. However, with the help of various Brazilian ministries and authorities, along with press bureaus in Brazil, we've been able to piece most of the story together. So Chagas lived in São Luís in the state of Maranhão, where he was born. He was a bicycle mechanic who lived all but a few years of his life in San Luis. There he made the mistake of committing his crimes in his own backyard. In 1991, as far as we can tell, Chagas began attacking boys, some as young as 4. In one case, when the police were doing a reenactment of the murder of a 4-year-old child, the child's name was Daniel Ferreira Ribeira, Chagas volunteered to participate. Those overseeing and participating in the reconstruction had no idea that the boy's killer was among them. He was arrested in São Luís in December 2003 at 38 years old, and he was only caught because he asked a 14-year-old boy, Jonathan Silva Vieira, to help him pick acai in the forest. The boy told his older sister where he was going and who he was with. When the boy disappeared, Chagas was the prime suspect, and that allowed police to search his residence. And at that point, boy, was it over for him. Investigators would discover the bodies of other victims, including 4-year-old Daniel. Prosecutors would acknowledge that the justice system in Brazil was prepared for acts of terror, for organ trafficking, and even for black magic, but they were ill prepared for a serial killer. The cases related to Chagas would lead them to develop psychological profiling resources, evidence collection techniques, and examination resources that could separate the individual victims' cases. Chagas always used the same modus operandi. All of his victims were males, less than 15 years old. All were emasculated. He partially strangled them before raping them and before emasculating them. He always lured the boys into the forest to pick fruit or to hunt birds. He collected their blood, drew a cross on the ground, and covered the cross with the blood. He would wrap the body parts in a piece of the victim's shirt and throw it into the water. He would then collect tucum leaves and cover the body. It was a very, very specific modus operandi that helped authorities determine that he had 42 victims in all treated exactly the same ritualistic way. He was brought to trial for only one murder first, and that was for the murder of Jonathan Vieira, his last victim. That's what they had the strongest evidence on. And he would be sentenced to 20 years, 8 months for that first conviction in 2006. It would be after that trial and before the several more that reporters would be allowed to interview him. He did not talk much to media, but he repeatedly expressed that he had no empathy and repeated claims that he was not a bad person. Eventually, he would refuse to speak to media at all and sometimes tried to kick or punch them when they approached. In March 2010, at trial number 7, he was sentenced to an additional 26 years for the murders of Ivanildo Pavoas Ferreira, who was 10 years old. At a trial in 2014 for the deaths of 3 children, Raimundo Nonara da Francisco Filho, 11, Eduardo Rocha de Silva, and Edevan Pinto Lobato, 12. The 11th of the trials. His sentence had reached 385 years and 6 months in prison. Further investigation showed that there were at least 12 similar and earlier cases in the city of Para in Altamira. Chagas would confess to these, and he was living in Para at the time of all the murders. When he moved to São Luís, the killings in Para stopped. 3 boys would survive attacks by Chagas and Para. They were badly injured and bloodied, but alive. All 3 had been emasculated. The first of his victims there, and his first official victim at all, was Yodavanas de Macedo Escocio. 10-year-old boy. After his confession, police would take him on to Para, where he showed them where he left the bodies of each of the 12 boys there. And GPS markers would indicate that in each case, he was actually within half a meter of where the remains were found. Chagas claimed to hear voices and see a white floating being above the ground after each killing who would tell him who to take next. He expressed no remorse ever and no empathy for the families. In Maranhão, 5 people had been arrested for the murders and 1 was wrongfully convicted. In 2013, the president of the Human Rights and Minorities Commission called for a review of the evidence in 4 cases where men were unjustly convicted for murders between 1989 and 1993 that Chagas had committed. The review covered the deaths of 12 children who were murdered and mutilated in Para. The 4 men were convicted in 1 trial held in 2003. There were 2 doctors, Cecil Caldas Brandeo, 56, who was sentenced to 56 years in prison, and Inicio Ferreira de Souza, 72, who was sentenced to 76 years in prison. Now, they were both in prison still during the review. The other 2 men had died before the review could happen. And those 2 men were still in jail despite the fact that the federal Supreme Court had ordered their release way back in 2009. In 2001, Brazil was slammed for human rights failures, ineffective police, omissions of local authorities that allowed Chagas to get away with a decade of serial killing. Police would tell worried mothers who were trying to get their help to find their missing children that their children were simply out there using drugs. Remember that these are kids under 15, and some of them were as young as 4 years old. Brazil would commit in December 2005 to really significant change. The government, to compensate the families, would provide a lifetime pension and a new home, all built together for each of the 28 mothers. For 18 of those mothers, though, living together in the same neighborhood only reinforced their trauma. Everyone knows who they are. There's no escape from what happened to their families there and no reprieve. And so they chose not to live in that neighborhood. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying these videos and you want to see more, please click the subscribe button and hit those notifications so that you don't miss any uploads. We appreciate you. Thanks.